Mercy tasted hot copper and the bitter ash of burning pine. Freezing mud pressed tightly against her right cheek. Heavy black boots settled into the slush mere inches from her face. Polished leather groaned under the weight of a man casually stepping over Caleb Thorne's broken body. Blood pooled rapidly in the frozen ruts of the wagon trail. Every red drop seeping into the soil belonged to her. 48 hours ago, she had chosen pity over common sense. Metal scraped against rock with a sound like tearing iron. The noise ripped through the cold morning air of the valley. A massive black shape thrashed wildly in the cabbage patch. Mud flew in wet, heavy clumps as a wolf the size of a draft horse slammed its body against the wooden fence. Its head was entirely swallowed by a dented tin milk bucket. Claws tore at the frozen earth in blind panic. The beast repeatedly slammed its skull into the wooden posts. Splinters rained down on the frosted leaves. Caleb stood 20 yards back. His pitchfork trembled in his ancient hands. "Leave it be, girl." Mercy ignored him. She threw her weight over the top rail of the fence. Her leather boots hit the soft soil with a wet thud. The wolf froze at the vibration of her landing. A low, vibrating growl rattled the tin surrounding its jaws. Jory watched from the barn door. The young boy held a wooden bucket of feed tight against his chest. His knuckles were bone white. He did not blink. "It is going to snap its own neck," Mercy said. She stepped closer. The smell of wet fur and panicked animal sweat hit her nose. The wolf lunged blindly. It missed her legs by an inch and crashed into the stone water trough. Ice shattered into jagged, crystalline shards. Freezing water soaked the thick black fur. The creature whimpered. That small, pathetic sound broke something deep inside Mercy. She dropped to her knees in the freezing mud. "You foolish girl," Caleb spat. He did not move a single inch forward. Mercy grabbed the bottom rim of the bucket. The metal felt like solid ice against her bare skin. The wolf thrashed backward instantly. Her shoulders wrenched painfully in their sockets. She dug her heels deep into the dirt. Mud sucked greedily at her boots. The beast violently whipped its heavy skull from side to side. Slippery gray metal cut sharply into her palms. She twisted the tin cylinder hard to the left. A sharp scrape echoed loudly as the rim caught on something beneath the surface. Blood immediately seeped from under the jagged edge of the metal. The wolf shrieked. It was a high, unnatural sound that made her teeth ache. Mercy planted her boot squarely against the wolf's muscular shoulder and pulled with absolutely everything she had. The vacuum broke with a sickening pop. The bucket flew backward out of her bleeding hands. She crashed hard into the frozen cabbage rows. The wolf shook its head violently. Thick black hair stood on end. A fresh, jagged cut ran directly across the bridge of its nose. Bright red blood dripped steadily onto the morning frost. For a split second, the monster did not look terrifying. It looked utterly humiliated. Wide, manic eyes stared at the girl sitting in the dirt. Then the beast turned and bolted into the tree line. Pine branches snapped like dry kindling. The massive shadow vanished completely into the heavy timber. Mercy sat up slowly. Her hands were covered in freezing mud and animal saliva. The dented bucket lay sideways in the dirt. Caleb walked over with agonizing slowness. He did not lower his pitchfork. He kicked the discarded tin container. It rolled heavily through the frost, revealing a thick smear of bright crimson along the sharp rim. That blood on the metal was a promise. If you want to know exactly whose blood will be spilled to repay this debt, subscribe and turn on notifications to follow Mercy into the dark. Mercy wiped her hands roughly on her coarse canvas trousers. Freezing air stung her raw knuckles. She picked up the bucket. The metal felt significantly heavier now. The image of the beast, perfectly captured in photo 2026, 08-12-08-30-35-2.jpg, burned stubbornly into her memory. The wide, terrified eyes, the ridiculous, chaotic sprint away from a laughing girl. It had seemed almost comical in the bright sunlight. Now, the shadow of the timberline felt incredibly oppressive. Morning broke the next day with the sickly color of a bruised plum. Frost heavily coated the shingled roofs of the settlement. The valley remained deathly silent. Not a single rooster crowed to greet the dawn. The settlement existed entirely on leased time. Every acre of dirt, every rotting barn, and every rusted plow belonged to the Richter Timber Company. The rumble of heavy wooden wheels shattered the quiet. 6 massive draft horses pulled an opulent black carriage down the muddy central road. The animals snorted thick plumes of white steam into the freezing air. Leather harnesses creaked rhythmically. Iron-rimmed wheels carved deep, ugly trenches into the slush. The carriage finally stopped directly in front of the communal well. Villagers stepped cautiously out of their small cabins. Doors creaked loudly open on rusted hinges. Men slowly removed their worn felt hats. Women pulled wool shawls much tighter across their narrow shoulders. Mercy stood stiffly by the water trough. She held a wooden scrub brush in her right hand. The stiff bristles dripped lye soap down onto her boots. The heavy carriage door swung open. Vaughn Richter stepped down. His boots were polished to a flawless mirror shine. The black leather looked pristine and unnatural against the foul mud of the valley. He wore a heavy wool overcoat tailored perfectly to his broad, imposing shoulders. A thick gold pocket watch chain caught the weak morning light. He gripped a heavy ebony cane topped with a gleaming silver wolf head. Richter surveyed the miserable crowd. His eyes were flat, cold, and entirely devoid of human warmth. He slowly turned his head to scan the filthy faces of the assembled farmers. Mercy completely stopped breathing. The wooden scrub brush slipped from her numb fingers. It hit the mud with a wet, pathetic slap. Across the bridge of the timber baron's aristocratic nose was a fresh, jagged cut. The wound was raw, red, and swollen. It perfectly matched the curved rim of a tin milk bucket. A suffocating dread dropped like an anvil into Mercy's stomach. The world tilted violently sideways. The terrified animal thrashing in her cabbage patch had not been a mere predator. It was the man who owned them all, the man who held the absolute legal debt to their lives. She had put her bare hands on him. She had wrestled him aggressively in the dirt. She had stripped him of his dignity in broad daylight. Richter's gaze snapped sharply toward the sound of the dropping brush. His eyes locked directly onto Mercy. The silence stretched until it felt like a crushing physical weight pressing against her skull. He did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. A slow, terrifying smile crept across his thin lips. It did not reach his dead eyes. He abruptly turned his attention away from her. "Caleb Thorne," Richter said softly. His voice was smooth and rich, resembling freshly oiled leather. "Step forward." The old man shuffled out hesitantly from the crowd. He clutched his battered hat tightly to his chest. His knees visibly shook beneath his patched trousers. "Mr. Richter, we did not expect you until the very end of the month." "Plans change, Caleb," Richter replied smoothly. He leaned heavily on his silver-tipped cane. "The yield from this valley has been immensely disappointing. The timber is wet. The cuts are terribly sloppy. I find myself seriously questioning the discipline of my tenants." Caleb swallowed hard. "We have worked from sunup to sundown, sir. The frost came extremely early this year. It slowed the axes." "Excuses are the currency of the weak," Richter stated flatly. He paced a slow, deliberate circle around the terrified farmer. "I do not deal in excuses. I deal in absolute respect, and I feel a distinct, rotting lack of respect in this settlement." Mercy took a hesitant half-step forward. She wanted desperately to scream. She wanted to confess right then and there. The overwhelming urge to draw the monster's attention back to her was nearly blinding. If he knew she recognized him, he would certainly kill her quickly, but Richter absolutely refused to look at her. He was meticulously putting on a public show. "Line up," Richter commanded. The smooth veneer of his voice cracked severely, revealing a jagged, incredibly violent edge underneath. "Every man in this miserable camp. Now." Nobody moved for one agonizingly long second. Richter slammed the heavy silver tip of his cane straight into the frozen earth. The sound cracked like a military rifle shot. Men scrambled frantically. Fathers pushed their young sons forward. Brothers pulled each other roughly into a ragged line directly in front of the ornate carriage. Jory stood at the very end of the row. The boy was trembling so violently his teeth loudly chattered. He kept his terrified eyes glued firmly to the mud. Richter walked slowly down the ragged line. He examined each man critically, evaluating them like pieces of defective farm machinery. He finally stopped right in front of Jory. "You were standing by the barn yesterday morning," Richter stated coldly. It was not a question. Jory choked on a sudden sob. "Yes, sir." "You watched the incident in the cabbage patch," Richter continued smoothly. He raised a gloved hand and gently tapped the silver wolf head of his cane against Jory's chin, violently forcing the boy to look up. "You saw the entire commotion." "I didn't do nothing, sir," Jory pleaded weakly. Hot tears spilled over his dirt-streaked cheeks. "I just stood there." Richter's eyes darkened to a shade of black that seemed to swallow the morning light entirely. "Exactly. You just stood there." The wealthy timber baron turned slowly back to Caleb. He casually adjusted his immaculate wool collar. "A debt is heavily owed for the disrespect shown to my personal property yesterday. I strictly require a tithe, not in timber, in blood." Caleb dropped instantly to his bony knees in the mud. "Mr. Richter, please." The girl meant absolutely no harm. "She is simple. She doesn't understand the complex ways of the world." "I am not speaking of the girl, Caleb," Richter said in a terrifyingly gentle whisper. "A creature of no consequence cannot possibly offer insult. The true insult uniquely comes from the men who allowed it to happen. The men who stood by and watched their betters struggle in the mud and did absolutely nothing to intervene." Mercy felt her ribcage physically cave in. He was not going to punish her. He was going to brutally punish the audience. The realization hit her brain with sheer physical force. Her survival was not a lucky oversight. It was the meticulously planned centerpiece of his revenge. "Take my land," Caleb begged loudly. He pressed his wrinkled forehead deep into the slush. "Take the mules. Take my entire share of the winter stores." "I already own your land," Richter sneered with intense disgust. "I own your miserable mules. I own the very food currently rotting in your mouth." Richter stepped forward purposefully. He did not shift into a beast. He did not grow sharp claws or sprout thick fur. He remained entirely, horrifyingly human. He raised the heavy ebony cane high above his head. The silver wolf flashed brilliantly in the weak sunlight. The heavy cane came down, dense wood powerfully connected with fragile bone. A sickening crack echoed loudly off the wooden walls of the cabins. Caleb collapsed completely sideways. Blood instantly sprayed a stark red pattern across the white frost. Women screamed hysterically. The men standing in the line violently flinched, but nobody stepped forward to help. The overwhelming, paralyzing fear of the alpha held them firmly in place. Richter struck again, and again. The heavy, wooden thuds turned wet and sickeningly sloppy. He beat the old man with a methodical, terrifying rhythm. Mud splashed up onto his polished leather boots. He clearly did not care. His face remained perfectly impassive. The extreme physical exertion barely ruffled his tailored overcoat. Mercy screamed rawly and lunged forward. Two of Richter's armed guards immediately grabbed her arms. They dragged her roughly backward, their heavy boots tearing deep gouges into the soil. She fought them exactly like a wild animal. She bit viciously. She kicked wildly. She threw her head forcefully backward, smashing her skull squarely against a guard's jaw. The man grunted in pain, but held incredibly fast. "Stop!" Mercy shrieked desperately. Her throat tore with the sheer volume. "It was me. I did it. Look at me." Richter steadfastly ignored her. He delivered one final, crushing blow straight to Caleb's skull. The old man completely stopped moving. Richter stood up perfectly straight. He casually wiped a small speck of blood from his pale cheek with a pristine silk handkerchief. He looked directly at Jory. The boy was actively hyperventilating, staring in absolute, unfettered horror at the ruined body lying in the mud. "This is the steep cost of your collective silence," Richter said evenly to the trembling boy. He neatly pocketed the handkerchief. "Tomorrow morning I will return. I firmly expect another payment, and the day after that, I will collect until the foul disrespect has been thoroughly washed from this valley." Richter turned smoothly and climbed back into his luxurious carriage. He never once looked in Mercy's direction. The guards shoved her violently into the dirt and mounted their massive horses. The driver cracked a long leather whip. The heavy draft animals lurched aggressively forward. The heavy wooden wheels rolled quickly out of the settlement, leaving behind a silence so absolute it physically hurt the ears. The villagers remained entirely frozen in place. Nobody spoke a single word. Nobody went to the body. Mercy slowly pushed herself up from the freezing mud. Her entire body felt completely hollowed out, as if her insides had been violently scraped clean with a rusted knife. She walked incredibly slowly to the communal well. Her boots felt like they were filled with heavy lead. She picked up a wooden bucket. She dropped it numbly into the dark shaft. The splash echoed distantly far below. She pulled the heavy, wet rope up, hand over agonizing hand. Freezing water spilled over the wooden rim. She walked back mechanically to the center of the road. Mercy knelt gently in the frozen ruts. She dipped a torn piece of rough burlap into the freezing water. She pressed the dripping cloth to Caleb's ruined face. The clear water instantly turned a violent red. She wiped away the grime, revealing the terrible, irreversible damage underneath. She stared endlessly at the blood soaking into the earth. The realization crystallized in her mind with cold, terrifying clarity. Richter was absolutely not going to stop. He was going to systematically slaughter every single man in the valley who saw him wearing that tin bucket, starting directly with Jory at sunrise. The paralyzing knowledge that staying quiet meant watching the rest of her community be butchered settled deep in her bones, leaving her with only one impossible, violent path forward. Steel struck unyielding dirt with a harsh metallic ring. Frost fractured violently along the rusted iron spade. Jory drove his heavy work boot downward onto the curved shoulder of the shovel. Bone-jarring vibrations shot directly up his rigid calf muscles. The hardened Appalachian soil absolutely refused to give way easily. Black earth splintered into sharp, jagged clods instead of turning over smoothly. The young stableboy forced the dull blade downward again. Blisters covering his raw palms tore completely open under the aggressive friction. Fresh blood slicked the worn hickory handle. He did not stop digging. Caleb Thorne's grave remained stubbornly shallow. Night completely swallowed the isolated timber valley. Bitter wind whipped mercilessly through the jagged granite peaks, dragging the sharp scent of raw pine sap across the ruined cabbage patch. Lanterns were strictly forbidden by the terrified elders. Light drew unwanted attention from the high ridge overlooking the settlement. Absolute darkness provided the only fragile illusion of safety remaining to the farmers. Mercy knelt quietly at the very edge of the expanding rectangular pit. Her canvas trousers soaked up the freezing moisture leaking from the excavated mud. She gripped a rough, jagged stone in her right hand. She aggressively scraped dried, crusted blood from beneath her cracked fingernails. The metallic copper scent of violence lingered stubbornly on her calloused skin. "We have to move into the upper tree line before sunrise," Mercy whispered. Her voice sounded incredibly harsh against the biting wind. Jory violently pitched a heavy shovelful of dirt over his narrow shoulder. Frozen clods rained down loudly onto the dead grass. The company holds the only supply road for 50 solid miles. Moving into the timber is just choosing to freeze instead of bleed. An older farmer named Elias crouched directly behind a stacked cord of wet firewood. He chewed nervously on a split splinter of white oak. "The boy is actually right. Richter completely owns the southern bridge. He strictly controls the trading post at the main junction. Leaving this valley means walking blindly into the deep winter with absolutely nothing in our pockets. Staying here means waiting patiently for the slaughter," Mercy countered coldly. She stood up abruptly, tossing the bloodied rock into the dark brush. The sharp crack of stone hitting wet wood echoed briefly through the silent camp. Jory leaned his exhausted weight against the shovel handle. His narrow chest heaved rapidly under his patched wool coat. Sweat froze instantly in thin white lines across his dirt-streaked forehead. Mr. Richter is a highly calculating businessman. He operates purely on ledgers and margins. We just need to correct the sudden deficit. He beat Caleb into a bloody pulp right in front of your face, Mercy stated flatly. Because of a terribly perceived disrespect. Jory pleaded loudly. His voice cracked with sheer naive desperation. We can double the timber yield immediately. We can cut deep into the old-growth stand on the high eastern ridge. We will offer him twice the lumber. That rapidly corrects the ledger. The structured rules of commerce still apply. Elias spat the wooden splinter forcefully into the mud. Double the yield requires 30 strong men working completely around the clock. Then we work around the clock, Jory insisted violently. He drove the heavy spade back into the frozen earth. We follow the signed contract to the letter. We will show him we are highly valuable assets to the company. Mercy stared intensely at the bleeding blisters currently covering the boy's hands. The absolute suffocating delusion sickened her stomach. The wealthy timber baron did not operate on rational commerce or financial logic. He operated on a fragile, monstrous ego disguised as aristocratic authority. Caleb had understood the true nature of the predator. That knowledge had cost the elder his life. The distant, low rumble of heavy wooden wheels, vibrating against the valley floor, instantly froze the blood in her veins. Dawn had not yet broken over the mountains. The sky remained the sickly color of a deeply bruised plum. Gray fog rolled thickly over the freezing mud, obscuring the foundations of the rotting cabins. The rhythmic, terrifying thud of massive hooves steadily amplified through the heavy mist. "They are already here," Elias whispered in pure horror. The older man abandoned the firewood cord instantly. He scrambled desperately toward his small cabin on his hands and knees. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a definitive thud. The iron latch clicked loudly into place. Complete cowardice infected the entire settlement rapidly. Doors barred aggressively shut down the entire length of the muddy road. Shutters slammed tightly closed against the encroaching gray fog. Jory dropped the bloody shovel. The heavy iron blade sank deeply into the loose dirt at the bottom of the open grave. He stared blindly toward the main valley road. "Run," Mercy commanded sharply. She grabbed the boy's rigid shoulder. He refused to move a single inch. "I have to explain the new timber yield to him. I have to respectfully present the financial offer." "He is not coming for lumber," Mercy hissed. She dug her fingers painfully into his collarbone. "He is coming for the witnesses." The heavy black carriage violently crested the small hill leading into the settlement. 6 massive draft horses snorted thick plumes of white steam into the freezing morning air. 2 armed guards rode aggressively on either side of the opulent vehicle. They carried long, heavy leather whips coiled tightly in their gloved hands. Jory finally broke. Pure survival instinct overrode his naive financial theories. He spun around and bolted directly toward the dilapidated communal stables. Mercy immediately dove behind the stone wall of the dry well. She pressed her spine tightly against the freezing, mossy rocks. The heavy carriage wheels carved incredibly deep, ugly trenches into the slush directly past her hiding spot. Mud sprayed forcefully against the wooden sides of the cabins. The procession stopped abruptly in the exact center of the camp. One of the mounted guards expertly snapped his long leather whip. The sharp crack sounded exactly like a pistol firing. "Bring the boy out." Silence answered the brutal command. The valley residents remained entirely hidden behind their barred doors. The guard aggressively spurred his massive horse forward. The heavy beast trampled directly through the ruined cabbage patch. Iron horseshoes crushed the remaining frozen vegetables into wet green slime. The rider reached the closed doors of the wooden stable. He did not dismount. He simply drew a heavy iron pistol from his hip holster and aimed it squarely at the rotting wood. "I will gladly burn this entire structure to the ground," the guard shouted loudly, with every single miserable animal trapped inside. The stable door creaked open agonizingly slowly. Jory stood terrified in the dark threshold. His hands were raised slightly in front of his chest, in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Hay stuck randomly to his sweat-soaked hair. The guard holstered his heavy weapon rapidly. He leaned sideways entirely out of his leather saddle. His thick, gloved hand shot forward violently. He grabbed Jory directly by the collar of his patched coat. The massive horse reversed forcefully. The guard dragged the screaming boy completely out of the barn. Jory lost his footing instantly. He crashed hard into the freezing slush. The guard did not release his iron grip. He dragged the thrashing boy aggressively behind the horse. Sharp rocks tore through Jory's thin trousers. Freezing mud rapidly coated his entire left side. The rider finally deposited the boy directly in front of the black carriage. Vaughn Richter stepped out slowly. The timber baron looked impossibly pristine against the backdrop of the filthy, decaying settlement. His heavy wool overcoat remained flawlessly tailored. His polished leather boots gleamed brightly in the weak morning light. The fresh, jagged cut running across the bridge of his aristocratic nose looked incredibly angry and swollen. It served as a glaring, violent reminder of the tin bucket. Richter leaned heavily on his silver-topped ebony cane. He stared coldly down at the bleeding boy trembling in the mud. "Stand up," Richter commanded smoothly. His rich voice carried clearly through the damp morning air. Jory scrambled frantically onto his hands and knees. He slipped twice in the slick mud before finally finding his footing. He kept his terrified eyes firmly glued to the timber baron's immaculate boots. "I understand you have a highly detailed proposal regarding the Eastern Ridge timber yield," Richter said softly. Jory swallowed hard. His vocal cords visibly bobbed in his thin throat. "Yes, sir. We can double the output immediately. We can work directly through the nights. We will gladly surrender our entire share of the winter stores to cover any outstanding debts." Richter sighed heavily. He reached slowly into his inner coat pocket. He retrieved a pristine white silk handkerchief. "You seem to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of our current transaction, boy. I am completely uninterested in your manual labor." The Baron stepped deliberately closer. He gently placed the silver wolf head of his heavy cane under Jory's chin. He forced the boy's face aggressively upward. "Tell me exactly what you saw yesterday morning," Richter whispered dangerously. Jory squeezed his eyes tightly shut. Tears leaked rapidly from the corners. "I didn't see absolutely anything, Mr. Richter. I swear on my mother's grave. I was just feeding the mules." "Lying is a deeply offensive habit," Richter stated coldly. The silver cane tip pressed painfully hard into the soft flesh of the boy's throat. "I require the absolute truth. You stood by the barn doors. You watched the entire incident unfold in the cabbage patch. Describe it strictly out loud for the entire camp to hear." "Please don't make me say it," Jory sobbed openly. Richter slowly lowered the heavy ebony cane. He turned casually to the guard, seated on the massive draft horse. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The guard snapped his long leather whip violently. The heavy braided tip struck Jory squarely across the back of the knees. The boy shrieked in absolute agony. His legs buckled completely under the brutal impact. He collapsed hard into the freezing mud, clutching his torn trousers. Mercy watched the psychological torture from behind the stone well. Her fingernails bit painfully deep into her palms. The sheer, suffocating helplessness of the situation threatened to crush her lungs. She understood exactly what the monster was doing. He was meticulously stripping away every ounce of Jory's dignity before executing him. He was forcing the boy to recount the very humiliation that had sealed his fate. "Begin the story," Richter demanded smoothly. He idly wiped an invisible speck of dust from his expensive sleeve. Jory gasped frantically for air. The freezing mud smeared across his pale face. A beast came rapidly out of the woods. It got heavily stuck in a milk bucket. It was thrashing wildly in the dirt. "Keep going," Richter urged quietly. His dead eyes scanned the closed shutters of the surrounding cabins. He knew perfectly well the entire village was listening in terrified silence. "Mercy pulled the bucket off," Jory stammered weakly. "The beast ran away immediately. That is everything I saw. I swear to God." Richter crouched down slowly. He brought his pristine face horrifyingly close to the bleeding boy in the mud. "You are deliberately leaving out the most crucial details. How exactly did the terrifying beast look when the metal was violently removed? Did it look powerful? Did it look entirely in control of its domain?" Jory shook his head frantically. "No, sir. It looked scared." The timber baron's perfectly straight teeth clenched tightly together. The muscles in his pale jaw feathered aggressively. "Scared. How highly fascinating. And what exactly did the terrifying beast do when it realized it was entirely at the mercy of a filthy farm girl? Jory could not form the words. The absolute terror completely paralyzed his throat. "Answer the question loudly," Richter hissed venomously. The fragile veneer of his aristocratic composure began to visibly crack. Mercy forcefully shoved her way completely out from behind the stone well. Her heavy boots hit the frozen slush with a loud, defiant crunch. The sound instantly shattered the suffocating silence holding the entire village hostage. Both armed guards snapped their heavy iron pistols directly toward her in unison. She ignored the deadly weapons entirely. She marched aggressively into the exact center of the muddy road. The beast whimpered exactly like a beaten cur. Mercy shouted at the top of her lungs. Richter froze completely. He did not turn around immediately. The absolute stillness of his posture radiated pure, unadulterated violence. "It smelled heavily of raw fear and wet dog," Mercy continued loudly. She deliberately projected her voice toward the closed wooden shutters of the cabins. It scratched blindly at the dirt because it was far too stupid to simply walk backward out of the trap. The mounted guard closest to the carriage lowered his heavy pistol slightly. Complete confusion washed rapidly over his bearded face. He looked hesitantly toward his employer. Richter slowly stood up. He turned around to face the filthy farmhand. The jagged cut across his nose pulsed angrily with fresh, dark blood. "You have absolutely no idea what you are inviting into your life," Richter whispered softly. His voice barely carried over the freezing wind, yet it completely cut through the ambient noise like a sharpened razor. "I know exactly what you are," Mercy spat fiercely. She pointed an accusing finger directly at the jagged wound on his face. "You are not a king. You are just a pathetic, overgrown stray that got his thick skull firmly wedged in my tin garbage. And you are so completely fragile that you have to murder a terrified child to make yourself feel large again." The silence that followed was incredibly absolute. The wind completely stopped blowing through the pine needles. The massive draft horses stopped violently snorting steam. One of the armed guards actually let out a very low, nervous scoff at the detailed description. That tiny sound of suppressed amusement completely detonated the situation. Richter's pristine composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. His pale skin rapidly flushed a deep, mottled purple. His eyes widened significantly. The whites of his eyes instantly flooded with pitch-black ink, swallowing his irises entirely in less than a second. A sickening, wet crack echoed loudly across the open road. Richter's lower jaw subtly dislocated. The heavy bone shifted unnaturally forward with the terrible sound of tearing ligaments. He dropped the expensive silver cane entirely into the mud. He did not issue a verbal command to his men. He did not draw a weapon from his tailored coat. He lunged forward with explosive, impossible speed. Mercy did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She spun around violently and sprinted directly toward the steep incline of the eastern timberline. Adrenaline immediately flooded her entire system. Her heavy leather boots pounded aggressively against the frozen ruts of the wagon trail. She threw her arms, pumping wildly by her sides. The raw physical exertion burned incredibly hot in her lungs. She bypassed the ruined cabbage patch entirely. She vaulted forcefully over the shattered remnants of the wooden fence. A horrifying, guttural snarl completely eradicated the silence directly behind her. The sound was not remotely human. It vibrated heavily through the soles of her boots. Mercy crashed through the first thick line of dense brush. Jagged thorns tore deeply through her canvas trousers. Freezing branches whipped aggressively against her unprotected face. She ignored the stinging pain completely. The steep incline of the mountain immediately forced her to lean her weight heavily forward. Heavy, unnatural footfalls crushed the dead foliage violently less than 50 yards behind her. The crashing sound was massive, indicating a creature far larger than a grown man rapidly destroying the undergrowth. She scrambled frantically up a steep embankment of loose shale. Small, sharp rocks gave way treacherously beneath her heavy boots. She slid backwards terrifyingly fast. She dug her cracked fingernails deeply into the frozen root system of a massive oak tree. She hauled her entire body weight forcefully upwards. Her right knee slammed painfully into a jagged piece of exposed granite. The guttural snarling grew exponentially louder. The monstrous predator was closing the distance with terrifying ease. Mercy reached the narrow, winding deer trail leading strictly toward the upper ridge. She forced her burning legs to move significantly faster. The freezing air scraped violently down her windpipe like crushed glass. The heavy scent of raw pine sap completely overpowered her senses. She risked a single, terrified glance over her left shoulder. A massive, shifting silhouette violently tore through the dense thicket she had just vacated. The sheer physical size of the shadow defied all rational logic. Trees physically bent out of the way of the charging mass. The creature was not running on two legs. It bounded aggressively on all fours, completely ignoring the treacherous terrain. Mercy faced forward rapidly. She pushed herself past the absolute limits of physical endurance. Her vision began to blur slightly at the very edges. The chaotic sprint through the freezing woods felt completely disconnected from reality. She needed to reach the high elevation quickly. She needed the specific geography of the old industrial ruins. The trees abruptly thinned out. The steep trail opened directly onto a wide, flattened plateau carved aggressively into the side of the mountain. Rusted iron tracks ran parallel to the cliff edge. Decaying wooden carts sat abandoned in the tall, frosted weeds. Directly in front of her yawned the massive, pitch-black entrance of the abandoned copper mines. Thick wooden timbers heavily braced the crumbling stone archway. A deeply metallic smell wafted slowly from the absolute darkness within. Mercy stopped running. She stood completely still at the very edge of the gaping black hole. Her chest heaved violently. Sweat poured heavily down her freezing spine. She reached slowly down to the heavy iron pickaxe resting against the rusted mining cart. Her fingers wrapped tightly around the worn wooden handle. A massive, inhuman howl violently shattered the tree line directly behind her. The sound carried absolutely no trace of Vaughn Richter's smooth, aristocratic voice. It was pure, unadulterated primal violence. The rules of commerce, ledgers, and men no longer applied to this confrontation. Mercy gripped the heavy weapon tightly with both bleeding hands. She turned her back completely on the weak morning light. She plunged aggressively forward into the suffocating darkness of the mountain with a monster that knew the tunnels intimately, armed with absolutely nothing but a rusted pickaxe and a firm death wish. Absolute blackness swallowed the weak morning light instantly. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees the moment Mercy crossed the threshold. Cold, stagnant air pushed aggressively against her face. It tasted heavily of rusted iron and undisturbed dust. She pressed her spine tightly against the freezing, damp granite wall. Her right hand gripped the heavy wooden handle of the pickaxe. Her left hand clamped firmly down on the dented tin bucket secured to her rope belt by a rusted carabiner. She needed complete silence. The darkness stripped away her sight entirely. She relied heavily on the remaining 4 senses. Her boots stood absolutely still on the slick, angled slate floor. Water dripped slowly from the unseen ceiling. Plink, plink, plink. A massive, wet drag of heavy claws entirely drowned out the falling water. The sound originated from the main tunnel entrance just 30 yards behind her. Stone ground aggressively against stone. Heavy, unnatural breathing followed the terrible scraping noise. The exhalations sounded wet and ragged. The sheer volume of air being forcibly displaced indicated a chest cavity the size of a draft horse. The beast was not stalking cautiously. It was forcing its massive bulk recklessly into the narrow opening. Rotting support beams groaned loudly under incredible pressure. Splintering wood cracked like rifle shots in the confined space. Richter was completely ignoring the physical limitations of his new form. The aristocratic timber baron was gone. Only the humiliated, violently fragile Alpha remained. Mercy slid her left boot forward cautiously. The rubber sole caught the jagged edge of a loose shale rock. She shifted her weight incredibly slowly. The rusted iron pickaxe felt immensely heavy in her bleeding, blistered hands. She trailed her raw knuckles along the rough stone wall to guide her path deeper into the mountain. The beast roared. The sound was entirely deafening. It rattled the loose gravel violently off the low ceiling. Dust rained down heavily onto Mercy's shoulders. The concussive force of the guttural noise vibrated painfully in her teeth. Richter was no longer tracking her by scent alone. He was using sheer volume to flush his prey out of the shadows. She did not run. Panic in the pitch black guaranteed a broken ankle or a fatal fall down an abandoned ventilation shaft. She forced herself to walk with agonizing precision. She counted her steps meticulously. 1, 2, 3. She remembered the exact layout of the copper mine from her childhood. Her father had worked these exact veins before the company squeezed the life out of him. The primary artery descended sharply to the left. The secondary tunnels branched off like shattered glass to the right. A loud, wet snap echoed from the tunnel behind her. A heavy iron cartwheel shattered completely under massive weight. The monster was moving significantly faster now. It completely disregarded the sharp metal debris littering the floor. Mercy turned sharply down the left descending corridor. The air grew immediately fouler here. A strong scent of sulfur mixed violently with the rotting wood. The floor angled dangerously downward at a 30-degree pitch. She leaned her entire body weight backward. She dug the heels of her boots aggressively into the slippery, wet clay. Massive claws clicked rhythmically against the stone directly at the corridor entrance. He had found the turn instantly. She reached the bottom of the incline. The tunnel widened significantly into the main excavation cavern. Complete darkness still obscured the vast space entirely. She knew the wooden support structures here were incredibly old. The company had abandoned this specific section 10 years ago because the overhead rock was dangerously unstable. Massive, rotting oak pillars held back hundreds of thousands of tons of compressed slate. Mercy unclipped the dented tin bucket from her belt. The metal felt freezing cold against her calloused palms. She remembered the exact sound the bucket had made when the wolf was trapped inside it. The high, screeching scrape, the metallic amplification of panic. She gripped the wire handle tightly. She raised the heavy iron pickaxe with her right hand. She struck the side of the tin bucket violently with the blunt side of the pickaxe head. A sharp, deafening metallic gong shattered the darkness. The noise bounced aggressively off the stone walls. It multiplied instantly. The acoustic properties of the cavern turned the single strike into a chaotic, overlapping wave of harsh sound. The beast completely stopped moving. Mercy struck the metal again, harder. The jarring noise mimicked the exact trauma of the cabbage patch perfectly. It was chaotic, loud, and entirely disorienting. She struck it a third time. The tin severely dented inward. The noise screamed through the tunnels like tearing sheet metal. A frantic, confused whine echoed from the dark corridor. The sound was shockingly pathetic, coming from a creature of that immense size. The sophisticated predator instantly devolved back into the terrified, trapped animal from the morning frost. "Come on!" Mercy screamed at the top of her lungs. Her voice cracked with raw physical exertion. "Come get it." She threw the heavily dented bucket forcefully down a narrow, degraded side shaft. The tin clattered violently against the rock floor, rolling deeper into the extremely confined space. The beast completely lost all tactical reasoning. Pure, unadulterated narcissistic rage overrode any remaining survival instinct. A terrifying snarl ripped through the cavern. The massive black shape launched itself recklessly toward the metallic noise. Mercy stood perfectly still next to the primary load-bearing timber. She held the pickaxe tightly with both hands. The sharp iron point angled directly toward the rotting wood. The monster squeezed aggressively into the narrow side shaft. Its massive, muscular shoulders scraped violently against the jagged stone walls. It completely ignored the agonizing friction. Hot, foul-smelling breath washed forcefully over Mercy's face. The stench of raw meat and ancient copper was overpowering. She could hear the wet slavering of its massive jaws snapping wildly in the blackness. The creature lunged completely forward. Mercy dropped entirely to her knees. She swung the heavy pickaxe forcefully in a wide, vicious arc. The sharp iron spike bit deeply into the center of the rotting oak pillar. She did not stop there. She used her entire falling body weight to violently rip the tool sideways. The ancient wood groaned in absolute agony. A sickening crack echoed directly above her head. The heavy timber completely splintered outward under the catastrophic damage. Jaws snapped shut aggressively mere inches from her left ear. A massive, wet tongue brushed against her cheek. Thick, coarse fur rubbed violently against her shoulder as the monster's momentum carried it completely over her kneeling form. Mercy abandoned the pickaxe instantly. She dove face first into a narrow, foot-deep drainage crevice carved into the floor of the cavern. She curled her entire body into the tightest ball possible. She pressed her hands forcefully over the back of her neck. The mountain shrieked. The sound defied any human description. It was the violent, agonizing roar of 1 billion tons of compressed earth finally giving way. The splintered oak pillar collapsed entirely. The ceiling dropped with horrifying speed. Total destruction buried the cavern in less than a second. Massive slabs of jagged slate crashed violently downward. The floor shook so hard Mercy bit completely through her lower lip. Hot blood instantly filled her mouth. Deafening explosions of shattering rock replaced the air entirely. Choking, thick dust forced its way aggressively down her throat. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut against the violent barrage of flying debris. Small stones pelted her exposed back mercilessly. The noise was absolute, crushing physical pressure. It felt like standing directly underneath a roaring waterfall of solid iron. Then, silence fell. The sudden quiet was heavier than the noise. The dust settled slowly in the pitch black. Mercy kept her hands firmly over her neck. She waited. Her lungs burned fiercely for clean oxygen. She slowly opened her mouth to draw a shallow breath. The air tasted entirely of pulverized stone and ancient dirt. A low, wet gurgle vibrated directly through the solid rock a few feet away. Mercy turned her head agonizingly slowly. She could not see absolutely anything, but she could hear it perfectly. Vaughn Richter was not dead. The massive wolf was pinned incredibly tight beneath thousands of pounds of collapsed slate. The beast could not move a single inch. It could not thrash. It could not turn its heavy head. Short, frantic puffs of air squeaked desperately from its crushed lungs. Claws scratched weakly against a stone slab, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of the earth. Mercy lay perfectly still in the narrow crevice. She listened to the terrified, suffocating monster for a long time. The arrogant timber baron who demanded total respect was now permanently caged in the dark. He was trapped inside a stone bucket he could absolutely never remove. She slowly pushed herself upward. Her back screamed in absolute agony. A heavy layer of sharp gravel slid off her canvas coat. She crawled forward on her raw hands and bleeding knees. She followed the incredibly faint, cool draft of air flowing from the original entrance. The main corridor had partially survived the collapse. The crawl back to the surface took over an hour. Every single muscle in her body trembled violently with extreme exhaustion. She dug through several small piles of fallen debris with her bare, bleeding fingers. The sharp slate severely cut her cuticles completely open. She ignored the pain. She just kept moving toward the weak draft of fresh air. Faint gray light finally pierced the oppressive darkness. Mercy dragged herself aggressively over the last pile of jagged rocks. She spilled out of the mine entrance onto the frosty plateau. The weak winter sun had barely crested the high mountain ridge. It offered absolutely no warmth. She collapsed onto her back in the freezing weeds. She stared blankly up at the colorless sky. The adrenaline rapidly drained from her bloodstream, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. Her hands shook violently. She forced herself to sit up. She could not stay on the mountain. Mercy stood up on incredibly unsteady legs. She began the long, agonizing walk back down the deer trail. The descent was a blur of physical pain and freezing wind. She stumbled repeatedly over exposed roots. She tore her trousers further on the dense briar patches. She did not feel any of it. Her mind remained entirely blank. She finally reached the edge of the timberline. The ruined settlement sat quietly in the valley below. The black carriage was completely gone. The guards had clearly fled the moment the mountain collapsed, knowing their employer was either dead or permanently lost. Mercy walked incredibly slowly down the muddy wagon trail. The villagers were gathered in a loose, terrified circle near the center of the camp. They stared openly at her as she approached. Nobody cheered. Nobody rushed forward to offer a warm blanket or a hot cup of tea. Their faces were hollow, traumatized masks of extreme grief and fear. They looked at her exactly as they had looked at Richter, like a violent, unpredictable force of nature that had entirely destroyed their fragile world. She ignored the silent crowd completely. She walked straight past Elias and the terrified women. Caleb Thorne's body still lay exactly where he had fallen in the freezing mud. The brutalized remains were covered lightly with a thin layer of fresh frost. Mercy walked directly to the communal well. A clean wooden bucket sat unused on the stone ledge. She picked it up. Her bleeding, raw fingers stained the smooth wood a bright crimson. She dropped the bucket slowly down the dark shaft. The rope burned fiercely against her torn palms as she hauled the heavy water back to the surface. She carried the sloshing bucket back to the center of the road. She knelt stiffly in the frozen ruts beside the old man. She found the discarded, blood-soaked burlap rag she had dropped earlier. Mercy dipped the coarse cloth completely into the freezing water. She wrung it out forcefully. The water ran bright red over her knuckles. She gently pressed the wet rag against Caleb's ruined face, carefully washing away the grime and dried blood. The icy water pooled in the deep tracks left by the carriage wheels. It mixed slowly with the freezing mud. She continued to clean the body in absolute silence. The stark reality settled heavily over the destroyed camp. Surviving a monster did not make you a triumphant hero. It just meant you were the one left alive with the agonizing burden of cleaning up all the blood.
That freezing water, mixing with the blood in the mud, is the heavy reality of survival. If you have ever had to pick up the pieces after someone else's destruction, drop the name of your city in the comments below, so I know where my survivors are watching from. Make sure you hit that like button, share this story, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a trip into the dark.